On the night of October 19, 1856, the most popular preacher in England watched 7 people die while he was supposed to be preaching about God's grace. Charles Spurgeon was 22 years old. He had been invited to preach at the Surrey Gardens music hall because his own church couldn't hold the crowds anymore. 12,000 people packed the building that night. And then someone, no one ever found out if it was an accident or a prank, shouted, "Fire!" There was no fire. But there was a stampede. And when it was over, 7 people were dead, 28 were seriously injured, and Spurgeon was carried out of the building in a state of collapse. He didn't preach for weeks. He couldn't. He sat in the home of a friend in the countryside and, by his own account, couldn't stop seeing their faces. And here's what matters about that moment. Not just as biography, but as doctrine made physical. The man who spent 40 years preaching that God governs all things, that not a sparrow falls without the Father's knowledge, that every thread of history moves by sovereign design. That man had to go into a room alone and decide what he actually believed. What he came out believing is the subject of this video. You've heard God is in control. You've probably said it. Maybe someone said it to you at the worst possible moment. When you got the diagnosis, or when you found out your denomination had quietly revised what it taught for 40 years, or when your son or daughter said faith was something they'd moved past. And there's a version of that phrase that lands like a screen door on a submarine. It floats on top of the real thing. It doesn't go down to where you are. That version of sovereign grace is a doctrine for people who haven't tested it yet. It sounds like this: God has a plan. Everything happens for a reason. You'll understand it later. Hold on. And it's not wrong. Exactly. It's just said from a place above the water rather than in it. What Spurgeon discovered, not in a seminary but in the specific gravity of real loss, was something different. Something that sounds the same from a distance, but functions completely differently when you're standing in the wreckage. This is what that difference is, and why it matters for where you are right now. Before Surrey Gardens, Spurgeon preached sovereign grace the way most people think about it, as a system. He was a Calvinist at 19, confident and clear, and he taught the doctrines of grace with a certainty that sometimes bordered on the combative. He wasn't wrong, but there's a version of theological certainty that is more about the beauty of the system than about what it costs you to believe it when everything that system is supposed to explain is actively falling apart around you. He believed that God elected a people from before the foundation of the world. He believed that Christ's atonement secured the redemption of those people, not merely made it possible. He believed that the Holy Spirit called the elect irresistibly, and that once genuinely saved, a soul would not finally fall. He preached all 5 points by name, without apology, from the beginning. And then the stampede happened. And what you find when you trace Spurgeon's preaching from that point forward is not that he abandoned those doctrines. He didn't. What changed is what he did with them. Before Surrey Gardens, sovereign grace was architecture, a structure he admired and defended. After Surrey Gardens, it became something more like a ledge. The only one available when the floor was gone. That's a different relationship with a doctrine, and it produces a different kind of preaching. By 1888, Spurgeon was a man in serious physical pain. Gout, kidney disease, recurring bouts of what we would now recognize as severe depression. He was in the middle of what he called the Downgrade Controversy, which is a polite name for the experience of watching his own Baptist Union welcome men who denied the substitutionary atonement of Christ, while calling him, Spurgeon, the problem for saying so. He had lost friends. He had lost colleagues he had trained. He would lose the vote. The Union voted against him, and he would die 3 years later at 57 in Menton, France, too sick to stay in London. In that same year, 1888, Spurgeon published the Cheque Book of the Bank of Faith. The book is daily devotional readings, 1 promise of God per day, drawn from Scripture. In his own preface, he describes it as something gathered specifically for believers who are tried and afflicted, not for those in comfortable seasons, but for those who need a promise they can actually cash. Think about what that means. The man who was losing his health, losing his allies, losing his institutional footing, that man sits down every day and draws 1 promise of God from the bank and hands it to someone who has even less than he does. That is not a man who finds sovereign grace abstract. That is a man who has discovered that sovereign grace is the only currency that doesn't lose its value when everything else does. And it raises a question that's worth sitting with. If the doctrine were cold, if God is in control were the screen door, it sometimes sounds like, why would a man drowning in exactly that way reach for it every single morning? The answer is what changes how you hear the phrase. Here is the thing about Calvinist theology, that people who argue against it rarely sit with long enough. Spurgeon was one of the most relentless evangelists of the 19th century. He pleaded with people to be saved. He preached, according to the records, to more than 10 million people over his lifetime. He organized missions. He trained pastors. He wrote letters by the hundreds to people he'd never met who were in spiritual crisis, urging them toward Christ. And he did all of that while believing, completely and without reservation, that God had already determined who would be saved. That's the apparent contradiction. That's the thing that looks from the outside like it should have paralyzed him. If God has already chosen, why beg? If the elect will come, why exhaust yourself? The answer Spurgeon gave, in his own words and in the logic of his practice, is this: because sovereign grace is not a reason to stop. It's a reason to stop worrying about the result. He preached with everything he had. He prayed with everything he had. He wrote devotionals for the broken while he himself was breaking. And through all of it, he was not carrying the weight of whether it would work. That weight belonged to God. The outcome was already held. What Spurgeon was responsible for was faithfulness, not success. Presence, not results. That is a completely different way to live inside a calling. And it is a completely different way to carry grief. If you've been praying for a son or daughter who has walked away from the faith, and you've been doing it for years, maybe decades, you know what it feels like to carry the weight of an outcome you cannot produce. You've said every right thing. You've prayed every morning. You've loved them well and you've loved them badly, and you've tried every combination of patience and directness, and they're still where they are. The version of sovereign grace that doesn't go deep enough says, keep praying, God has a plan. Which is true, but it doesn't answer the question underneath the question, the one that sounds like, am I the reason this hasn't happened? Is there something I'm doing wrong? Is my faith strong enough? Is my prayer right enough? That question has a weight to it that sovereign grace, rightly understood, is designed to remove. There's something available in the description right now. A 30-day devotional workbook called Praying for Prodigals. A 30-day guide from the Psalms and Spurgeon. Each day is built around a specific psalm that Spurgeon preached, and a specific promise he named for exactly this kind of waiting. Not generic prayer advice. 30 days of standing in the gap with a man who understood what it meant to pour everything into something whose outcome was not in his hands. The link is in the description. Back to Spurgeon. Back to what the doctrine actually does when it's functioning the way he understood it. There is a moment, not a date, but a pattern across his sermons, where Spurgeon addresses the person in the congregation who is holding on by the thinnest possible thread. Not the strong believer. Not the settled theologian, the one who is barely there. And what he says to that person is not try harder and not your faith will grow. What he says is something that lands like a structural shift. He said, "It is not your hold of Christ that saves you, but his hold of you." Let that do what it does, because that sentence is not pastoral comfort first. It's a theological statement that produces pastoral comfort. The doctrine of sovereign grace in its fullness says that your salvation, and by extension, your sustained faith, your ability to keep showing up, your capacity to still believe after 40 years, and after the denomination changed, and after the grandchildren said they didn't need this anymore, does not rest on your grip. It rests on his. You are not holding on. You are being held. That is the inversion. That is what changes the phrase "God is in control" from a screen door into something load-bearing. The people who hear "God is in control" as cold are hearing it as a statement about God's indifference. He's in control, and you're just a variable in his plan. But that's not what the doctrine says. The doctrine says he is not merely in control of the large mechanisms. He is specifically, personally, actively holding you. The sovereignty is not a system that runs without him. It is his direct hand. Spurgeon knew that. And he knew it not because he had read it and agreed. He knew it because he had tested it in rooms where nothing else worked. Here's what the record shows about the last years of his life, and why it matters for your present decision. He knew the vote was going against him. He knew the union would not stand with him. He knew that the men he had poured himself into had chosen institutional peace over doctrinal clarity, and that his name would be associated with division and difficulty. He knew he was dying faster than he wanted to. And in those years, his preaching did not get angrier. It did not get harder or more bitter. What the historical record shows, in the sermons from the late 1880s, in the letters his wife Susanna preserved, in the devotional writing he kept producing, is a man who had genuinely transferred the weight. Not because he stopped caring, he cared intensely, but because the doctrine he had defended his whole career had become, in his experience, exactly what it claimed to be: a ground that held when there was no other ground to stand on. He said, in a phrase that has been widely repeated and that the record confirms in spirit, if not always in precise attribution, "God is too good to be unkind and too wise to be mistaken." That sentence is not easy. It doesn't make the losses stop being losses. It doesn't explain why 7 people died at Surrey Gardens, or why his union voted against him, or why a man who preached to millions died at 57, far from home. It doesn't give you the reason. What it gives you is the freedom to stop needing one. That's the exchange. That's the thing Spurgeon found that you don't find in the academic version of this doctrine, and you don't find in the comfort version either. Sovereign grace, rightly understood, does not ask you to pretend the loss isn't a loss. It doesn't ask you to manufacture peace you don't feel. It asks you to do one specific thing: hand the outcome back to the one who holds it anyway. And it tells you something precise about the nature of that exchange. Not that you will understand, not that you will feel peace immediately, but that the ground you're standing on is not dependent on whether you feel it. The ground holds because of what he is, not because of what you manage to believe on a given morning. Spurgeon got to the end of his life with his doctrine intact and his certainty quieter and his grip loosened. Not because he had lost faith, but because he had found what faith was actually for. It was never for the seasons when everything worked. It was for exactly this. The question that stays with you, and you don't have to answer it here, is smaller than the ones we've been sitting with, and goes deeper. Not, do you believe God is sovereign? You probably do, at least in the intellectual sense. The question is, have you handed him the outcome? Not the outcome of the denomination, not the outcome of the culture, the specific one. The one you've been carrying so long it's shaped the way you walk. Spurgeon handed his, not once. It was a daily practice, which is exactly why he sat down every morning and drew one promise from the bank. Not because he had achieved surrender. Because surrender, it turns out, is not a moment. It's a discipline. He lived that, and he didn't make it look easy. He made it look like something a real person could actually do. That's the unbroken line, not the one that never breaks, the one that holds.